Eternal Life of Madness is the sophomore full-length album from Santiago, Chile-based death thrash metal band Pentagram. This is a band that are best known for their two demo tapes back in 1987. They did eventually reform a number of times over the years, a la Possessed, and eventually produced a full-length album in 2013 where they re-recorded their full discography, about 7 songs at that point, back from the late 80s, and a full album of new material, which was a little bit different than expected. It was an early 90s death metal style with some of the a groove metal touch to it, which made sense because these are also some of the key members of Criminal, a well-known Chilean sort of groove metal and death metal style band, which we could liken to maybe the popularity of Sepultura in some sense, as the way that they evolved their sound. What to expect from this second album 11 years later, beyond the first, is more of the same. It's still an early 90s style death metal band focused on grooves. Their style is very recognizable as their own in some sense, but really they've just iterated on that last album. There won't be a ton of minutia to get into here, so I guess the thing to do, rather than parse over their history and blow it out of proportion, we'll cut to a song and see what's pretty well done on this record, what's new and what sounds great. Now, for me, the history of Pentagram is pretty interesting. It's relevant to early death metal. It's relevant to the influence of bands like Slayer and Possessed on death metal, and how that direct translation led to a sound that was maybe closer to like a band like Repulsion early on, which was focused on defining the death metal groove. And I think that was always really the most interesting thing about Pentagram's early demo tapes, and both that released in 1987, was that they were focused on a groove that defined death metal beyond Seven Churches, essentially. That translates well into what the work that they've done in the 2010s and now in the 2020s here, 10 years later, beyond the last. But really what they're doing is bringing late 80s death metal grooves and influences from like Celtic Frost and pulling that into their sound once again, but still producing an early 90s death metal style record. Essentially what we get here on this album is a repeat of the last, with a little bit more a difference in the pace changes, and pacing makes a fairly big difference here, but and also a pretty similar record. They've switched it up with some doom influenced songs. You can tell they're fans of doom metal when you hear some of these riffs. There's a couple that are just too obvious even. And the style of this band is classic, but more so in the 90s death metal style, and in a way that doesn't feel like it does justice to the zeitgeist of what Pentagram was early on. But they are continuing the thread in the sense that the last album went in a certain direction and they've continued on, but they've modulated it in a way that it's a little bit better of a listen. It's a little bit of an overlong listen. They've got one or two too many songs here, but it still builds upon the last idea pretty well and makes for an entertaining, aggressive death metal album that has plenty of memorable moments. There are some viable singles here that are catchy. That, like I said, they have got some obvious influences in there that make them a little bit of an event. They're supposed to evoke 80s death metal and that classic feeling of it. Here at a time where there's a lot of people that don't have that education and that sound, and I think that's partially where this album is most interesting, is that they're kind of having their day in the sun once every 10 years, pulling out this kind of record and doing it pretty well. I think that a song like Possessor is about as classic as you could get. It's one of the better songs they've written to date, and I think that it sort of gets you in the mood to sort of enjoy this album with the classic fare there. The problem is that they start to sound like bands that were contemporaries back in the day, without building upon that legacy so much. There's a little bit of Voivod-esque guitar work here that keeps it interesting. There's a little bit of Sepultura-esque groove all over this thing, and it's not exciting so much as it's a solid listen. And I'm not about to complain about consistent quality on a record like this, but I feel like I don't think this record needed to be as long as it was, and I don't know that it's such an event that it feels like a big deal that Pentagram are back after 10 years. Now, granted, I love this style. I'm a big fan of this band. I wrote a long, I think 50-week series of bands that went from thrash to death metal and were influential on death thrash metal and its formation in the late 80s, and I'm a big fan of this work and what they've done. So I'm keeping up with tabs on it because I'm a huge fan of it, but I don't see why this would be interesting if you weren't already a fan, because this is very much fan service in a way, but it's kind of also the best they can do without devolving to grooves that would be too simple. They can't necessarily be naive as they were back in the late 80s, and so that leaves us with a decent early 90s style record. For me, I'm just such a fan of this stuff that it wasn't a disappointment to me. I kind of expected them to be consistent, but this is so much like the last record. It feels like they haven't really moved too far from where they were back in 2013, and they don't really have those old songs, because the last record had the second disc of re-recorded songs from the late 80s. This record doesn't really have that backing to make it exciting as a return, and so it feels a bit comfortable in its own skin, and that's good enough for me. But if you're not already a fan, you're better off grabbing the first record and getting a sense of what was important about the band in the first place and seeing if you want more of that, because that's what this is. It's more of that. It's released back on April 26th. Go ahead and check that out for yourself and see what you think. See if this band is for you. If you're not familiar, this is an okay place to start, but I'd say listen to the untouched original demo tapes. Those recordings are available online, and see if you want to hear where they would naturally go with it, 20, 30 years later.
Activistic fear, existential dread.